Hi guys, I'm Kate. I'm a physical therapist, and I'm here with some of the team from 1HP to talk about the early research into health and performance in esports. So to kick things off, we'll do a little bit of an introduction and then we'll dive right into it. So like I said, my name's Kate. I'm a physical therapist. I've been a physical therapist for about 6 years now, since 2015. I've been working in esports for about the same amount of time. I'm the co-owner of a company called 1HP, which is a company founded by physical therapists, and we provide health and performance services to players, to teams, to schools, as well as helping non-endemic companies understand the esports healthcare landscape. And we provide our expertise for everything from compression gear to new research initiatives. We are also, every single one of us, absolute gaming fanatics. Ask me about my Guild Wars 2 crafting level hack sometime. I got my graduate degree from the University of Delaware, #1 PT program in the country. I'm also the co-editor of the Handbook of Esports Medicine, which is the first clinical textbook in the field of esports health and performance. I'm also an associate editor for the Annals of Esports Research, which is the first ever North American-based esports research journal. And I'm here with two of my colleagues, Elliot and John. So Elliot, why don't I hand it off to you?
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. My name is Elliot Smithson, and first and foremost, I'm also a huge gamer, as Kate mentioned. Played World of Warcraft for about 10 years, got into the Fortnite scene after that, but I've been playing games since I could hold a controller. A little bit more relevant to my medical history, I finished my undergraduate degree from the University of Central Florida in athletic training and sports medicine. And then I went on to Marshall University and got a master's in the same degree. I finished my doctorate of physical therapy in 2019 from University of St. Augustine with a heavy emphasis on manual therapy techniques. I've been working in sports medicine and performing arts medicine for the past 10 years in various facets. Esports really caught my interest because of a blending of several passions of mine for helping gamers actually optimize their not only performance, but also their health and ability to continue doing what they love without pain. It's a great pleasure for me to be here speaking to you guys today, and I really hope you guys can take something away from this lesson that we can all apply to our individual practices.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Jonathan Chung, DC. I'm also a personal trainer. I'm the chiropractor on the team. I'm from Canada as well, so the northern contingent of 1HP. I did my undergrad in life sciences and a minor in economics from Queens. I also did my Doctor of Chiropractic at the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College in Toronto. I've been with 1HP for a while now, about a year. It's been an awesome time. I've learned a ton, and I'm hoping that I can help the listeners here learn some more stuff about esports research. It's a very interesting topic, and it's something that we need to be evidence-based practitioners, which we should all aspire to.
Right. So let's talk a
Absolutely.
little bit about why we need that research in the first place. Because esports medicine is a fairly new field. And in fact, up until about, 2 years ago or so, we didn't even really have a name for this field of medicine. It was just, we were healthcare workers who happened to do esports stuff. And we've in that time coined the name esports healthcare or esports medicine. And when I say we, I don't just mean the team at 1HP. There are other physical therapists, there's physiatrists, there's absolutely sports psych professionals working in this industry. But we're pretty short on data right now, or at least published, peer-reviewed, replicable data. The reason that we need that data, well, for one thing, there's a pretty large population of people that play esports. They've probably got specific needs. We need to make sure we're knowing what they are so we can address them appropriately. Two, we need to consider the financial consideration for teams and developers. So looking at the way that the NFL, for example, or the WNBA has invested in research on their players, that affects player longevity, player injury risk, player performance, all of which has a financial tie into the league and to the ownership there. It's similar in esports. And really, this is a field and a population that is distinct enough to need its own data. Sure, there's some similarities between office workers and esports competitors, and sure, there's some similarities between traditional sports and esports competitors. But they're still, in our opinion, as people who've worked in this field for 6+ years now, distinct enough to need their own research. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, are esports sports and are esports competitors athletes? As though this determines whether or not this research should be done on this population. And honestly, our answer is, who the heck cares whether they're athletes or not? And who the heck cares whether this is sports or not? We don't decide that something's not worth studying, understanding, or approaching with intention just because it is or isn't a traditional sport. So we should give the same amount of consideration to esports competitors that we do to sports competitors, even if we're considering the specifics of what they do in different ways. And sure, we can draw from what we know in sports science about competition, about psychology in particular, about periodizing training schedules. But we need to make sure that when we're doing this research, we're not just thinking of esports as a more sedentary version of traditional sports, because it's not. So in the meantime, who can we borrow from? Quite a few, really. As I mentioned, we can absolutely look at office workers and traditional athletes. Office workers obviously use much of the same equipment as a large population that plays esports competitively: keyboards, mice, monitors. Not so much using joysticks and controllers as much, so they're leaving out our console playing players a little bit with just comparing that office worker research. We can also look, however, at folks like air traffic controllers, who do a cognitively demanding task sitting in the same position for a really long period of time. That's applicable to esports. Looking at musicians competing, performing in front of a large crowd, having some component of entertainment as well as skill at what you're doing, in addition to them maintaining a single static posture with really precise fine motor movement, definitely esports. And chess competitors, heavily cognitive, also involves stable static posture. Doesn't so much require you to have perfect precision, but I suppose if you want to make sure you're not touching your knight when you mean to pick up your rook, I guess that requires some amount of precision here. But even with our ability to borrow from the research that's been done in each of these regions, esports is still separate and distinct from all these fields. Sure, we described overlaps, but none of them are 100% this fits exactly, the Venn diagram is a perfect circle. So to provide evidence-based care, we need evidence. We need our own evidence that's specific to esports competitors. So let's talk a little bit about the data that exists right now. John, what do you got for us?
Well, we do have some research. It's not like we are completely devoid, but we need more. It's just not enough. We have some anecdotal advice from osteopaths or people who have some ideas on how to use acupuncture on gamers. We have some specific pain presentation research. So, for example, low back, but the very rare thing that we don't have a lot of is causation of pain studies. And those are very important, as you can imagine, because if we understand the pathology of a condition, then we can be much more proactive about preventing it or treating it. There's also some
looking at studies for gamers. We're not just looking at studies that necessarily have to do with pain specifically. I think there's a lot of different facets of the medical literature that are being looked at here. Is that correct, John?
Yeah, exactly. We are, like Kate mentioned, pulling from other fields. So the causation of pain study I talked about, where we're looking at the speed and force of keyboard operation, that was done on symptomatic and asymptomatic office workers. The other important part of esports is the performance aspect, which does have some research on it, and looking at some of the emotions and some of the differences between a pro player and a casual player are also really illuminating for us when we're trying to determine how to treat this population. It's really, really interesting right now being in the esports research field, because there's just so many things we need. Right. And if we can get some of those really, really interesting topics in, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but we can do some really, really awesome things in this space.
Yeah. And so there's a reason that there's 3 musculoskeletal medicine professionals on this call. There aren't too many of us who work in esports. I mentioned there's a couple more than even just work at 1HP, but the number of folks who are really experienced and experts in this particular field is limited. And I don't even call myself an expert. I'm just reasonably experienced at this point. We have experience, we have some degree of expertise, but we don't have data. And without data, we can't provide this kind of education to medical professionals who aren't as in the know about gaming or who aren't gamers themselves potentially. So we end up with this awkward gap between players and the professionals that they go to. We've had plenty of players come to us and say, oh yeah, I went to my doctor and because I had wrist pain and he told me to put on a brace and just rest for a while. And that's not really an option for folks who esports is their job, their career. They make money off of this. They need to be able to do it. And they need something more proactive than just rest and brace, which doesn't really work anyway for most tendon issues. So part of the reason why we need this data, obviously, is for medical professionals to do better by the esports community. But part of the reason we need the research too is so that esports competitors take their health and their performance seriously and recognize that they're being taken seriously. It's kind of a mark of respect to be doing this kind of research that, yeah, this field is serious enough that it deserves its own time and attention. So we're going to go into a little bit of some of the studies that are out there right now. This is by no means a comprehensive review. This is just a look at kind of some of the samples of the work that's available currently. We'll make some recommendations about what we think could additionally be done, and then to talk a little bit more about the overall research landscape.
Exactly. So this study was basically talking about what we were just discussing, that you need to treat esports players like real patients. They deserve care. They deserve good care. They deserve evidence-based care. They also mentioned, like we've been harping on, we need more research too. We want to be the most evidence-based we can and really push that side of things because that's where healthcare is going. The interesting part about the study was it is an editorial, but it has a very powerful message. And Hey,
John, just for folks who aren't in like the research field, let's describe what an editorial is too.
It's more of an opinion piece. So we're not really running an RCT. We're not doing a randomized control trial. We're not so much looking at subjects, but we're looking at what a need might be in this particular case and discussing it so that there's more information on the topic and starting that dialogue.
I will also say from a very pragmatic perspective, people writing editorials and getting them published in research journals is a really great way to convince your academic institutions that, oh, we should fund grant money for this particular research project where you want to test gamers on things. It's one of the utilities of editorials for sure.
Definitely. And this was
definitely a hallmark of early research for sure.
Yeah, this was a good paper. I enjoyed it. And one thing they brought up, which was interesting, is that esports is getting bigger, which means that competitions are getting bigger, prize pools are getting bigger, and there's a lot of pressure on the line when you're competing at the international for $1 million or more. And you can imagine that for some players that's a lot. But if we can get ahead of that and look at some of those risk factors and be proactive, then you won't have people retiring early. They'll have long, fulfilling careers, and that's what we want for every gamer.
John, as our resident Dota nerd, I do have to note the last time a team competed for only $1 million at the international was like at least 6 years ago at this point. Prize pool for, I gotta say, 2019 was like what, 23 million, I think, overall.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
Even more pressure though.
Right.
Sorry, gotta defend my Dota.
No, please fact check me. I like it.
But yes, we know that there's a lot of pressure. We know that there's a lot of competition. We know that things are getting, and more and more sports teams are buying into the esports world. But we still don't have that much data on how to optimize play and practice in esports.
Exactly. This next study was also very interesting. It was a scoping meta review, which is when you're looking at research, for people who aren't as familiar, you're looking at other reviews. So you're taking a wide bird's eye view of what might be out there in the research. And surprise, surprise, we need more.
Surprise, there's not much.
Surprise.
There's going to be a theme here, guys.
It's can you tell that we structured the presentation in a certain way to maybe push a certain agenda? But the interesting thing is that some of those hallmarks of gaming and esports that we assumed were inviolable are perhaps not quite so much. So one thing we a lot of people assume is that esports can make you more sedentary and predisposes you to weight gain, but and in one of the reviews that this scoping review looked at, it was non-significant findings. And of some of those other social aspects of gaming, yes, it can be a little isolating at times, but it can also expand your friend group online. And I'm sure that many of us who have been stuck at home for a certain period of time, I'm sure you can understand that seeing someone virtually and spending time with them, it's not the same as being in person, but it's still a very powerful and a very nice experience. And gaming is one of the things that facilitates that. It lets us connect with each other, which to me is one of the most beautiful things about it. Elliot, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there is some research out there that kind of looks at just what you were talking about, the socialization aspect of gaming. I believe it was a study looking at World of Warcraft players and how they are actually able to fight off kind of the symptoms of or the pitfalls of gaming, internet gaming disorder. Better than some of their counterparts that play solo games. So I really think that speaks to the fact that social gaming really does have some positive impacts on people's ability to have better mental health. So more studies like this that are specific for gamers' mental health, I think are really, really critical. And we're going to talk about a couple.
I think it's also really key that we're looking at not just the, how do we make sure that esports is competitive? How do we make sure that esports competitors are healthy and performing at their best? But also looking at the general overall landscape of, I guess, the community that surrounds that whole esports competition sphere. So looking at does playing this particular game competitively have any impact on your fine motor control? Does it have any impact on your ability to regulate your emotions? Does playing a team game versus playing a solo game have an increased or a decreased effect on your ability to control your emotions? How does team communication play into that? That feeling of tilt, that feeling of being, stressed out and anxious and frustrated at a game. These are all really great questions that we don't have a whole lot of answers for. There's definitely more research on the psychological side of non-competitive gaming and kind of the social health there. But there's not nearly as much on the communication, teamwork, and performance side of esports as associated with mental health, as associated with mental skills, like emotional regulation, like executive function.
Exactly.
So one of the things that this scoping review shows us is there's not all that much. We need more.
Yes, exactly.
This one was pretty great, though, and I know, John, you're pretty excited to talk about this one because this was one of the first ones that discussed like gamer health specifically. It's, to be clear, not just esports, but there really, again, there's not too many studies that are differentiating gaming from esports, like competitive gaming right now. So we did have to fold in some of the non-competitive gaming studies here. Yeah,
exactly. So this was a really, really awesome health guide, and they looked at trying to optimize three things, which is we want to build awareness of common MSK problems and health hazards. They want to promote health in the gaming space, and then some recommendations for performance. I love this framework. You want to treat gamers holistically, and it's not just pain, but you also want to care about performance. You play games to have fun and to compete. And especially in esports, the competition side is paramount. So performance has to be considered in this situation. One thing that I didn't love about the study was they did mention carpal tunnel quite a few times, and Kate will explain why that perhaps is not ideal a little bit later. They did a great job about ergonomics, giving some baselines. So just to run through for anybody who doesn't know, generally ergonomics are a way for you to hold yourself for a long period of time without a ton of strain on your muscles to ideally decrease pain. But ergonomics aren't everything. It's also, are you taking breaks? Are you hydrating enough? Are you sleeping enough? Is your nutrition on point? Is your mental health solid? All of those things contribute to your pain perception and your overall health as well. Absolutely. And we also know that actually changing your posture is the best Kate's smiling very widely right now because she loves talking about this.
We have a
But, like,
catchphrase.
people think about, people think about their chairs like, I'm sitting in my chair for so many hours while gaming. My chair must be the most important part of my posture and my ergonomics. I did not coin this phrase. I stole it from a designer for Herman Miller, but the phrase is your best posture is your next posture, which is to say moving around consistently is better than any one posture could ever be. You've probably seen me fidgeting around in my chair during this presentation, and we're only 20 minutes in at this point. Strongly recommend everybody who's tuning in right now do a little bit of shifting around, do a little bit of stretch. This is a great stretch break opportunity. But that's something that we really want to make sure as we're doing this research, we're incorporating, we're not reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So yes, we want our own esports specific research, but we also want to take what we already know from really analogous lifestyles, office workers, chess players, air traffic controllers, who do have to sit for long periods, and incorporating what we know there about consistent movement. And rather than like going and testing, are gamers better at playing if they maintain the same position, or are they better at playing if they change positions often? We know the answer. It's going to be the second one. We don't need to do that study. You can if you really want to, and somebody's going to fund it, but perhaps we should put our, research efforts in some more specific regions.
Perhaps. And there's also the performance aspect of ergonomics too. Your muscles have an optimal length-tension relationship where they can react the fastest, they can be the strongest, and ergonomics is part of that. It puts you in the position so that your muscles can work the most effectively. And making that connection for some of our gamers we've worked with, it makes a big difference, because suddenly it's not just, oh, do this and I won't hurt as much. It's also do this and I'll click more heads, do this and I'll play better. That's important.
And if we're able to put the numbers in front of people, say, look, if you do this healthy thing, you will perform better. If we have the data and the research to back that up, we can point them to a study and say, yes, we can prove that this helps. That makes all the difference in the world, because the gaming population, and esports in particular, is justifiably skeptical of non-endemic folks, let alone medical folks coming in and wanting them to make changes to what they're doing. So if we're able to say, yeah, we can prove that this will make you play better, then absolutely, that's so much better than just saying, I'm an expert and you should listen to me. We have to give a why. Here's why you should listen. Here's the proof.
I think that is a really interesting paradigm, coming in as non-endemic people in the space, or even if you have some gaming experience, unless you've played at a professional level, there is a lot of skepticism about your ability to make meaningful changes to the habits and behaviors of these players, because the mentality really is, hey, I made it this far on my own when everybody else doubted me. They're coming from a lot of, oftentimes, resistance from friends and families that have questioned their journey to professional gaming. I think we're seeing less and less of that as these things become more accepted. There are organizations dedicated to educating parents on how esports is actually a profitable profession and can build these life skills. But in order to kind of facilitate that that pathway for these players to actually make their dreams come true, it's really important that we are able to actually provide the research that shows that this can be done in a safe and healthy way, and how to really demonstrate the benefits. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, the benefits of gaming on kind of what we can take away as a society as a whole. But anyway, we're going to transition, speaking of performance, into kind of a more sports psychology, mental health, kind of intertwined with physiology type study here. So this was a really interesting study that looked at both psychological factors and physiological factors. So that kind of means more body response to stress, and specifically pre-game stress. And while we took a look at this study and we kind of concluded that it was fairly obvious information, what they ended up doing or finding was that professional players have greater psychological stress responses than non-professional players before a match. And I think that can kind of go without saying in a lot of our minds. Of course, that the pro player with money on the line is going to have more stress than the amateur player who's just playing kind of for fun or for bragging rights. But it's really important that we start laying the foundation for all of the work to be done on top of this. So now you can take a study like this and then cite this in other studies, given that this is already a known factor. Like, yes, we know that the psychological factors of stress are going to be greater in professional players. So now you can start building the case out for hundreds of other studies on top of this. So foundational work like this, while it may seem very, very simple and very, very rudimentary, is still wildly important in developing the field for everyone that comes after.
Right.
So
Exactly.
I think sorry, go ahead, Kate.
It's not just, I mean, it's obviously important for researchers and professionals. But again, this is also really important to gamers, to teams, to competitors, because sure, they'll take a look at this and say, like, yeah, no, of course, I'm more stressed when I'm playing, in the finals of the international than I was when I was playing in the AD2L Amateur Dota 2 League in the US. But sometimes research needs to quantify or prove obvious things that everybody in the industry knows, so that one, we can communicate this to outside people, and so that two, we can find the ways to address it. Because if we can't establish in the research this is a thing we need to address, then how do we test what's the most effective way to address it? We've quantified something we've only theorized about previously, which means we can address it more consistently. And we can say, yes, absolutely, we need folks who have sports psychology backgrounds, who have performance psychology backgrounds. We've provided concrete evidence here that competing at a high level is not the same as just casually playing. So that's important data for the players. That's important data for the teams. That's important data for anybody who wants to talk about, like, how are they making $1 million playing video games? I play video games. I should have gone into esports. No, you're not actually any good at it, Jan. I'm also not any good at it, which is why I'm not a professional esports player.
Kate over here spitting the facts.
But so studies like this, well, to those of us who've ever had any exposure whatsoever to esports are like, no, duh, of course this is the result. This is really, really important to making sure that we're providing the best possible care to players, because we're able to say, yes, we've established without a shadow of a doubt, this is peer reviewable, replicable data that says, yeah, this exists and we need to address it as a result.
Exactly. It's validating and that's the important part. And it's not just for us, but for anyone who might be new to the space, who thinks, like Kate just said, it's just video games. How could it be stressful? It is. When there's millions of dollars on the line, I think anybody would be a little stressed.
And I like that they, in this study, not only looked at the psychological factors, and psychological research can sometimes get a bad rap for not being expressly objective, but they actually looked at the cortisol levels in these players. So cortisol is a stress response hormone. So they really went in and did the blood work and looked at the actual cortisol response and noticed that it was higher. So it's not just something that you can say is quote unquote in your head. But there is an actual physiological response to this, which I think is just a really cool blending of both the psychological and the physiological.
Yep. You can't entirely disassociate the two. They kind of have to work together.
And I really think that is something that once the entire esports industry understands, we will see a major explosion in progress as far as performance goes. And
I've been really interested to see, actually, that a lot of the places where teams have been interested in investing kind of more long-term so far has been in that psychological side of things, which I think is fantastic. Because that is such a key component of things. But as this and other studies will show, we do have to address both sides of it. We can't just address the body or the mind. We need to address the two in conjunction in order to improve not just health, but performance.
Right. This goes back to our esports and athletes discussion, where it's oftentimes brushed off that the whole athletic component, because it's not perceived to be much movement involved. But as we know from working in this area, and as you can see from the musculoskeletal pain patterns that we're about to talk about, there is a lot of movement going on here. If you're using your body to do something, you should be addressing that just as much as the mind. But it is interesting how much emphasis is placed on the psychological in esports. But segueing myself here into the next slide.
Self-assist, I love it.
Yeah. There was a study done on Danish esports athletes, and this was a survey. So again, this is kind of a hallmark of early research. A survey is not necessarily the best way to get hard objective data, and we're not testing anything here, so you're not comparing one group to another like the previous study actually did. You are just looking at responses of these athletes. So you may not be getting the highest quality of metrics from this, but it is definitely worth looking at. And then actually taking these findings and then progressing them into more of kind of a randomized control trial study. But anyway, they had 188 responses, which is pretty good for esports, to be honest.
Really is, honestly.
Yeah, it's good.
And they were pretty representative of the population. And 42% reported having some kind of musculoskeletal pain, which is absolutely huge. If 50% of your population is complaining of something, it is definitely worth
perhaps we should look into that
more.
further and maybe address it if half the people we're working with are hurting.
Yep.
And as musculoskeletal professionals, as physical therapists, we have this this study is a little bit closer to our hearts, but that doesn't mean to say it's more important than any of the other factors that we've been considering here. Right. But a lot of the pain sites that people were reporting, 31% of people were reporting back pain. So whether or not they were differentiating between upper back, lower back, I'm not entirely sure in this study, but back pain seemed to be the biggest the site of pain for these players, and that I think is massively groundbreaking for perceptions of the community. I think every time that someone non-endemic to esports has brought up what I do, or I tell them that I work with professional players, they're like, "Oh yeah, they must get a lot of carpal tunnel, right?" That's the number one response that I get. I got a couple issues with that, which we will again discuss a little bit later.
There's a slide about that. Don't worry.
Yep.
But
carpal tunnel is an issue in the hand,
right.
And that's not even the biggest issue that we see when we poll gamers at large. Most of the pain is in the back. So even just foundational studies like this could be so meaningful, just to be able to point to this and be like, no, it's actually back pain. Neck pain is huge. Shoulder problems can develop. There's a lot of hip and kind of glute pain that go along with gaming as well. Nerve symptoms that can be triggered by tight muscles. There's a lot more to this than wrist pain. I actually pulled up the supplemental research on this where they kind of list out the percentages of players here that are experiencing different region or pain in different regions of the body. So it goes back at 25 or at 31%, neck at 11%, shoulder at 11%, headaches at 8%, forearm at 7%, wrist at 6%, hand and fingers at 5%. That's huge. Like, to understand that, no, it's not really all wrist and hand pain. You've got other areas of the body that need exploring here, and that's going to change kind of the way that we approach studying this population and molding future studies. So I hope I've kind of delivered the point here of how important these foundational studies are, and how simple it is to come up with a concept and just run with it as far as the study goes, because chances are you are doing something meaningful, whether you think it's a very specific topic or a very simple topic. And we'll get a little bit into kind of more action steps later on how we can go about formulating some of these study topics. But
so
I just think that's huge.
That one of the things that we can run into with a survey study, which this one was, is we're not getting necessarily objective data that we've measured. We're getting someone's perception of what's going on, which we can absolutely build out surveys that make things less subjective, more objective. We can build in questions that kind of back check each other in order to establish internal consistency within a survey. But survey studies like this are a really great place to start for two reasons. One, they're pretty darn inexpensive. And when nobody wants to fund your research, you need an inexpensive study to start with. And two, the results of this study, you can then take it, especially if you get it published, and say, look, we have published data that establishes back pain as a serious problem for esports competitors. We want to research that further. Then you can actually get grant money for that stuff. So kind of within kind of the progression of research, yes, we'd love to be testing a whole bunch of things that we've observed, either anecdotally or from our experience. But survey studies like this basically quantify that observed experience and then let researchers actually study it in a way that's consistent and objective and reliable over time. So for all that survey studies can get a bad rap, they're really, really valuable for, as Elliot said, the kind of foundation laying for building the research for a field. And it's really important, though, to consider, here's what a survey study is good for, establishing, do people have pain of some sort? And it's really important to note that in this particular study, they didn't pathologize any of the pain, which is to say, they didn't say this, they're reporting then that they have sciatica, or yes, they've confirmed that they have thoracic outlet syndrome. They're describing where they have pain. They have not ascribed a diagnosis to that pain, which is accurate, fair, and reasonable in a survey study. Because in order to diagnose somebody with something, there's usually a diagnostic criteria you have to go through. So if you were diagnosing, say, sciatic nerve issues, you'd probably want to look at their range of motion in their back. You'd want to look at their hamstring flexibility. You'd want to test the mobility of the sciatic nerve. You'd do certain clinical tests, like a slump test, for example, to put that sciatic nerve under tension and see, does that replicate the symptoms? You'd also want to rule out other things. So you might go in and palpate kind of the gluteal tuberosity, which is the butt bone, basically, seeing, is there tenderness here that I would associate with like a hamstring tendinopathy? You might check out and see, is there weakness or tightness in the glute muscles that I might think that there's a muscle compensating that's putting pressure on this nerve. And so all of those things go into creating a diagnosis. A survey can't replicate that, but a survey can give you general information about pain. Now, why am I going on and on about how a survey can't diagnose? I'm going to come back to yours, I promise, but this was just too good of a segue to miss.
All right, fine.
So there was a survey study that looked at carpal tunnel syndrome symptoms in esports competitors, which, not unreasonable. They do specify it's about symptoms. But the danger of a kind of study like this, where you're ascribing the results of a survey, a player describing where their pain is located, to a diagnosis, is you haven't actually confirmed they have that diagnosis. And you can, by publishing that research, create a misconception about how common carpal tunnel is or isn't. Now, this is not published research. This is my anecdotal experience as a physical therapist who's been doing this for 6 years. I have, in my time treating gamers, treated exactly one case of carpal tunnel syndrome. And it was in somebody who developed their carpal tunnel syndrome from a manual labor job. And they also happened to play games, which is where their symptoms presented the most. So the games brought out the pain. They didn't cause the pain. So there's saying that you have symptoms associated with carpal tunnel syndrome does not mean you have carpal tunnel syndrome. Some of the symptoms that are associated with carpal tunnel syndrome are associated with other conditions like tendinopathy, like other median nerve issues, like something like cubital tunnel syndrome, double crush syndrome, a cervical radiculopathy, a thoracic outlet syndrome, all of which are words that just sound like jargon if you're not in the medical industry. But it's basically, the gist of it is it's very, very difficult to diagnose any of those things without being hands-on with a person. And it's absolutely impossible to diagnose somebody with those conditions over a survey. So it's really important, as we're starting to develop the research and the foundations for this field, that we, contextualize our research and make it really clear that we're looking at player-reported pain as opposed to ascribing a diagnosis to it. And two, it's really important that the folks who are doing research have familiarity both with research and with gaming. There's got to be a blend of both. This can't be a one thing or the other, which again, we'll get into a little bit later on once I let Elliot talk about performance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where was I? All right. So this study about performance was actually interestingly put together. I've never seen a study kind of done like this, but it was kind of a two-part study. So in the first part of the study, what they did was they developed this kind of litany of abilities that they think that pro gamers should have or be able to be proficient at. So they kind of broke this down into several categories. Here's psychic or mental abilities, including personality, social abilities, the condition category. So those are things like physical fitness, endurance, speed, flexibility, constitution. So these are things like
This sounds like a D&D stat sheet.
Yep.
yeah. I really feel like they were very heavily inspired by kind of RPG style stats. Yeah. But anyway, constitution is things like your age, like your nutrition, sleep, things like kind of baseline factors, and then media competency. So those are like things like your ability to network socially through internet media like Reddit and Twitter, and like kind of finding information about the game and stuff like that. So these competencies, they then turned into a survey, and then they sent this survey out to a bunch of different gamers. I think 1,835 players they sent this survey to. So basically what they were looking at was, do these individual competencies change based on the game that you're playing? And again, this is another study where it's like, yeah, obviously it's going to. But it is good to have data like this in order to continue building that case up. But yeah, they ended up finding that the different games do have different skills that are more important or perceived important for these players. So while kind of oddly put together, I think they did come out with some good information that can be used by both people in our profession, as well as game developers, as well as sports psychologists, nutritionists. All of these different fields can, I think, maybe pull at least something from this study, just to kind of look at what the perceptions of large games actual population are. So any other
so like something that could potentially come out of a study like this is testing what skills are actually most important via an objective measure compared to what players perceive as most important. And if there's a mismatch there, determining why is there a mismatch, how do we help them understand which is actually the most relevant skill for what they're doing. Those are absolutely things that can then be built off of a study like this. So the really great thing about research is it builds more research, it builds more understanding. It lets us as professionals provide better care, and it lets players play better if we help them implement this research. So we've got some proposed best practices for research when it comes to researchers specifically, and we want to dig into that a little bit for sure. The first one is, I kind of mentioned that we didn't just want non-endemic folks to come in and do research on games without having any experience as gamers. That's not to say that you need to be an avid gamer in order to do games research, but you need to at least be familiar enough to kind of, I guess, respect the culture, have some degree of cultural competency around esports. This is not an us versus them venture. This is not the gaming industry versus academia. This is and should be a venture that incorporates the knowledge and the experience of folks who are endemic to esports, the players, the coaches, the staff, and then the research qualifications of non-endemic academic folks. Combining those two things together gives us studies that are relevant, that are well designed, and that actually have bearing on the esports world. So they don't just have theoretical research use; they've got practical, actionable use in the field that is being studied, which research should do. Research should provide, at least some amount of benefit to the folks who are being studied. And kind of on that note, I think it's really important when it comes to research to incorporate subjects into publications. And what do I mean by that? Well, in pain science research recently, there's been this push to have, as co-authors on papers, patients who are describing patient experience of pain, especially when you're talking about like the provider understanding of a patient's pain or the patient experience of pain, to have actual patients helping to write the papers. Now, does that mean that every patient has all kinds of, research background and experience? No, absolutely not. That's why they're a co-author, not a sole author. Um, but we know that expertise is not confined to academia. There are experts in their field, and we should absolutely make sure that the knowledge of those experts is well distributed and well transmitted, because otherwise we're just doing research on something that the industry already knows. And then that cements that kind of, well, there are these outside folks who don't know anything, who came in and tested a thing that we could have told them if they'd bothered asking us. So then there becomes kind of this headbutting thing. Whereas if you come in and you partner with folks who are already in the gaming community, already in the esports world, players, coaches, staff, us, then you're making sure that you draw on what's already there so that you can build what isn't. It can't just be a thing that academia does to gaming. It has to be a thing we do with gaming.
It's very recognizable when it is the former.
It's very, very clear.
You see E-S,
no!
and it's an immediate giveaway that these people have not talked to any players.
I will acknowledge there is I will acknowledge some degree of possible okayness with that if it's a paper in another language and it just got translated in the translation engine, put E-sports despite the fact that the AP style guide says esports, single word, no hyphen, no capitalized this. All right. So also important to consider when it comes to research, who pays for it?
So this is the question that everybody really is asking at the end of the day. And I think before we answer who's going to pay for this, I think we should answer why they should pay for it. I really think that there's a lot of applicability of esports to other fields. So esports is interesting because although we have established or tried to establish that it is not just a mental function, it is kind of the pinnacle of mental functioning competitively. There really isn't a whole lot of other kind of ways that we interface both in kind of the neuromotor control facets of intellectual, that's not the right word. It's difficult to find another field that quantifies all of these mental skills that we see represented in esports in a competitive setting, as well as we see in the competitive gaming world. So that being said, there is application to other fields within kind of that sphere of like mental function. So cognition is the ability to think, essentially. And there are studies out there that show that gaming actually does improve your ability to think critically, rationally, logically, strategically, all of these things that we value in society. And in both children growing up as well as aging adults. So I really think that it is in the same way that when we send someone to the moon, we advance technology here on Earth. It is worth looking at these facets of cognition and fine motor skills and how we can prevent deterioration in patients with Alzheimer's by studying how to push the boundaries with competitive gaming. And so who exactly would be interested in advancing this kind of line of knowledge? I think both academic institutions as well as medical organizations are very interested in kind of understanding how to push the limits in this way, as well as the government for various reasons, whether it be developing practice guidelines for our medical health systems, either for military involvement. All of these institutions, I think, can have a vested interest in kind of pushing that line of knowledge into understanding how the brain works at the highest levels.
Right. And so here we're talking about some of the more traditional structures of research funding, academic institutions, like publication. Medical organizations, we provide care. Of course, we're invested in the outcomes of our patients. And government organizations, both in terms of general for the public good, but also definitely when it comes to esports, there are military applications for the kind of stuff we study in gaming. But we are not at an academic conference or at a medical conference or at a government conference. We're at the game developers conference. So why should developers care? So the first part of the answer to this is not all of them have to, which is to say, yes, developers care about the players who play their games to some extent and in some way. We're talking specifically here about kind of the larger esports kind of organizations. We're talking about the developers who create games specifically to be played competitively as an esport. And those are, in our opinion, the kinds of developers who are probably going to care the most about this kind of research. Now, that's not to say that smaller indie studios won't care, especially if, say, you're developing a game that incorporates aspects of mental health. Then sure, absolutely, you're probably interested in and maybe even invested in the kind of research that comes out about mental health in games. But if we're looking at health and performance in esports, then the developers who create games that are esports are probably going to be the most interested here. So why should those developers specifically care? Why should the gaming and esports industry care about this? Well, when it comes to a purely pragmatic financial perspective, having longer player careers, having career longevity because players aren't injured and they're playing at a high level, there's financial value there. People want to watch people play at the highest level. People want to follow their favorite players, and a lot of fans follow players more than they follow just teams. Leagues want to have players who are able to play consistently over time because that gets people tuning in to watch it, which gets ad revenue, which gets your company money. But in kind of a more public good sense, investing in this kind of research creates a more stable, more sustainable industry. And sure, esports really started with so much grassroots work. Esports really started with community organization, especially in the fighting games community, for example. Still does rely very heavily on a lot of grassroots organization. But if we want to create the kind of stability that we wished we'd had when we were first getting started in all of this, if we want to create some reliability, some degree of security, some degree of infrastructure, that doesn't mean we have to become stodgy, and it doesn't mean we have to create the exact same thing that's already been done elsewhere that we don't particularly like. We have the opportunity to create a new health infrastructure in esports and a new performance and health model for our players. But we have to put the time and effort into it, because otherwise we're just going to have to borrow from everybody else, because that's the easier and less expensive way to do it. If we want a community that is ours, if we want an infrastructure that is ours and works best for us, we need to take the time and money to invest into it. Other reasons that developers could potentially care about this, really great way of correcting misconceptions about gaming is providing research that says, no, you are wrong. They're not basement dwellers who just, eat Doritos and drink Mountain Dew. And no, not just anybody could be a top tier esports competitor. The kind of folks who win, $8 million at the international really are exceptional, on par with, making it into the NFL in terms of the elite tier of the thing that they do. This also allows developers to tap into new markets. As we alluded to, having research that shows kind of the health benefits of competitive esports, as well as the ways in which esports can be integrated into an overall healthy lifestyle, absolutely improves parental support. Parents being the ones who have the money to buy the games that their kids play. So pretty important market to be tapping into. So this kind of research absolutely should be funded by traditional institutions, absolutely should be studied by traditional academic, medical, and government organizations. That being said, it's absolutely research that the industry should be interested and invested in, because it helps us create this more sustainable playing field for esports to continue to be a viable option to design games to be played in, for players to participate in, and for support staff to then design the structures that keep all of that up and functioning. It can't just be a thing that non-endemics care about, because if non-endemics are the only ones who care about this research, then non-endemics are the only ones who are going to do it, and we're going to end up with a whole bunch of people who don't know all that much about gaming, not drawing on the serious expertise that's already here that we could absolutely rely on for real value when it comes to research. So when it comes to research, what do we need?
Best
what do we need?
Practice guidelines.
Yes. What are those?
Exactly. There's a reason I put 3 exclamation marks here, because having some standardized care across the industry will do so much good. There's some very cool research out on tendons, and not everyone knows that isometrics can be really pain relieving while not being that disruptive to a training schedule. And there's just so much cool stuff out there that if we can standardize it and help other practitioners understand what the best way to treat someone is, we can make a humongous difference. And think about the scale of how many gamers there are in the world. There's millions, billions of them. And do they not deserve care any more than the millions and billions of people who play basketball? That's not true. They both need help. It's not a you take away from one and then you take away from the other. We can help both.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So prevalence data is basically in a population how often something occurs. And so having the understanding of how many people may have a certain condition, whether it be low back pain, wrist pain, finger pain, can help us a lot with understanding, okay, where do we need to invest the most time and energy? For, as we just learned with Elliot, we have a lot of low back pain. Maybe instead of focusing so much on fingers and hands, we should focus more on low backs with gamers, right? And understanding the physical demands of gaming also really, really helps us understand how to be proactive with injuries as opposed to reactive. And as many of you might imagine, using a mouse and keyboard, very different from using an Xbox controller or a PS5 controller. And then even then, you play Valorant, very different from playing Dota. And even if you play Dota, if you're solo carry versus support, that's very different inputs. Those have very, very, we know that these are different, but we don't know exactly how.
Right.
And
we
so
don't know if the
exactly,
distribution of pain that comes from these differences
Exactly.
is actually relevant.
Right.
So like the study that
Exactly.
looked at all these back pain issues, I don't think it was organized by actual games. So like understanding very
Yep.
specifically to the population you're working with is so important.
Yeah, like a great example
Exactly.
in Super Smash Brothers. We've seen more folks who play Fox having, tendon pain across the
Yep.
back of their hand than folks who say main Peach.
Yep.
Now, we can't prove that because we haven't done any research on it, but anecdotally, we're like, yeah, this absolutely makes sense. And so being able to quantify that, as John referenced, allows us to create more consistent care guidelines that are more specific and less general. Because right now, the general guideline that gets given out by folks who don't know gaming well is rest and brace, without really looking into, okay, what game do you play? What input device do you use? How long are you playing for? What character do you main within the game that you play? If your game is if your game is one that has a main character that you might play. Okay, what are the most common inputs you use on your input device? Are you wave dashing a lot as a Smash Fox player? Are you in Dota playing Invoker and having to do all of the really complicated invoking combinations, or are you like me playing Vengeful Spirit and just pressing? Look, stuns are good, okay? But like all of this information is really helpful and really valuable for understanding what areas are most under strain and what areas should we be starting to prevent strain in. What can we do for players to help them not get injured in the first place? Because we really run into a lot of players who don't want to see a healthcare professional because they don't think the healthcare professional is going to know what to do to help them. Which, you know what? Fair, based on our track record so far, that's a reasonable opinion to have. But if we could have a few less, highs and haxes in the world, having to retire due to medical injury that really could have been prevented, then we end up with more top tier players. We as spectators get to enjoy it a heck of a lot more. The industry stays more sustainable, and people leave because they want to leave, not because they're forced out by a medical condition that absolutely could have been prevented if we just had the data and the professionals who were in the right place to help provide that care.
Exactly. We want to help healthcare providers help people better. And that's the whole point of all this research and this entire presentation, is that we can do better. We do. I think at 1HP we do a great job, but we can help a lot more people if we.
And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to elevate the entire ecosystem of esports and the culture of gaming. So I really think that that's a great kind of final note to end on here.
We have a bit of a motto at 1HP, and our motto is play more, hurt less. And we want that to be an option for players. We want people to be able to play. We want that to be a part of a healthy lifestyle. We want esports competitors to be competing at their best, playing more, but without hurting. And in order to make that happen, we need the research to develop this industry, to develop this field of esports medicine. And that's the way that we provide the best possible care to players so that they can play more and hurt less. Thank you so much for joining us for this, guys. I think we've kept it to almost 60 minutes on the dot, which I'm pretty impressed by, got to be honest. We've been in chat answering questions this whole time. This is a little weird because we're pre-recording this. But if you ever have any future questions for us, you can always reach out to us on Twitter, which I believe will be posted here. We're more than happy to answer questions at any time because we really want to make sure that this is something that sticks around, that this research really continues to grow.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.